A perfect moment of joy, a peak of laughter or sudden relief from pain, always arrives with an expiration date. It feels absolute in the span of minutes, burning bright and certain, only to surrender its glow to something quieter, more enduring, yet less spectacular. The human pursuit is often framed as the relentless chase for happiness, the momentary zenith of pleasure, the sweet reward at the end of labor. Yet this constant seeking creates a peculiar tension between what we believe the goal to be and the quiet fact of how long that goal lasts. What if the highest state of being has nothing resembling peak emotion? We tend to confuse emotional high with fundamental stability, mistaking fluctuation for fulfillment. The mistake is in defining life by its sharpest edges. True flourishing does not reside in these peaks, but in the deep, steady valley beneath them. Peace, therefore, is not merely an absence of conflict. It is a robust disposition toward reality itself. To understand this difference, we must first dismantle how we define happiness. We treat it as a prize, something external that must be won through achievement, romance, or material accumulation. This viewpoint treats the self as incomplete, requiring outside input to become whole. The philosophical mistake here is assuming that contentment is an emotional state. If happiness were merely emotion, it would be subject to mood swings, exhaustion, and circumstance. It would dissipate upon reflection. Instead, we must approach stability through a concept of internal resilience, a capacity for the mind to remain unperturbed by the necessities of life. Stoicism offers a useful framework here. Thinkers like Epictetus taught that our suffering does not come from events themselves, but from our judgment about those events. The locus of control is entirely internal. Happiness, in this view, becomes contingent on maintaining an ideal state of judgment, a precarious and exhausting performance. It demands constant vigilance against disappointment. Peace, by contrast, suggests a deeper architecture. It relates less to emotional achievement than it does to alignment with what is. This moves the discussion from individual psychology toward ontology, or the study of being itself. Consider the Buddhist concept of nirvana. It is not described as an ecstatic state, but rather as the cessation of suffering and the extinguishing of grasping desire. The goal is not maximal pleasure, but minimal conflict, the stopping of the internal engine that constantly fuels disappointment. This framework shifts the focus from getting something, happiness, to letting go of something, attachment. Where happiness requires us to continuously elevate our expectations and strive toward an ever-receding peak, peace asks us only to cease resisting what already exists. It is a form of radical acceptance that feels less like striving and more like simply breathing into the moment's gravity. The difficulty with this understanding is that we have built modern culture around the metrics of high emotional output, promotions, perfect relationships, grand experiences. We live in a society that values spectacle over stillness, loudness over quiet competence. Peace demands an active form of withdrawal from these pressures, a turning inward that feels counterproductive to the prevailing economic and social currents. It requires acknowledging that deep stability is often boring, unremarkable even. The peace described by thinkers like Thoreau or certain forms of contemplative practice is fundamentally a refusal to participate in the exhausting performance required to maintain perceived happiness. This disciplined resistance is not apathy, it is profound self-possession, the realization that the deepest sources of disorder are seldom found outside our own minds. This recognition has a practical weight for how we navigate the inevitable friction of life. If our primary goal is happiness, every setback becomes an existential catastrophe because we have staked our entire sense of worth on the next high point. We become brittle and reactive. But if our aim is peace, setbacks are simply information, data points that show us where our judgment was misplaced or where our expectations were too vast for reality to bear. Peace trains a resilience not by shielding us from difficulty, but by allowing us to sit with it without panic. It accepts the gradient of life, the slow slide downward after the peak, the monotonous stretch in the valley, and the necessary pause before the next climb. So when we revisit that perfect moment of joy, the sharp burst of laughter or success, we no longer see its finality. We see its borders. We recognize it as a transient, wonderful episode, but not the defining measure of existence. The truest reward is realizing that the foundation beneath those passing moments does not require dazzling light to hold itself up. It simply requires steady, quiet attention. The sustained grace found in recognizing one's own capacity for equilibrium, that deep-seated stillness when everything else falters, that is the life worth living. We are often sold this narrative that life is measured by peak experiences, by the spectacular climax, the golden moment when everything aligns perfectly. We chase happiness as if it were a destination on a grand map, believing that once we arrive at sufficient levels of joy, all our struggles will simply vanish. But I suggest that this pursuit is inherently flawed because it demands perfection and guarantees disappointment. Happiness, by its very nature, is an emotional state. It is volatile, dependent on circumstance, and subject to the relentless entropy of modern life. It requires constant upkeep, a perfect relationship, a stable career, good health. And when any one of those pillars shifts, the entire structure of joy can feel threatened or even destroyed. Peace, however, is not an emotion. It is a disposition. It is the internal architecture that remains intact despite the shifting circumstances. It is the quiet recognition that your value does not fluctuate with the market, nor does your worth diminish when external praise fades. Peace allows us to build resilience, not just moments of bliss. It teaches us how to inhabit the messy, contradictory space between highs and lows, the valley floor where nothing spectacularly wonderful happens, but everything continues nonetheless. This sustained equilibrium is infinitely more powerful than any single burst of euphoria because it anchors the self in reality. If happiness is a brilliant flare that illuminates one perfect night, peace is the steady starlight visible every single night. It's the background hum of acceptance, the deep breath taken when we believe we have nothing left to give. And this brings us back to those initial moments, the pause before the next climb. We started by looking at the brief flash of joy, and now we see that the true wisdom lies not in maximizing those flashes, but in appreciating the profound emptiness surrounding them. The ability to simply be fully present, without needing a grand narrative or an immediate reward, is the greatest freedom we can cultivate. To find that quiet center, that place where the self rests effortlessly, unburdened by expectation, that is not merely contentment, it is true peace, and in its steady light, all other measures of success begin to fade into beautiful irrelevance.